Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabicer, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Join me each month as I dig into the stories behind our food system, discover new ways to live sustainably, and embark on culinary adventures around the globe or right in your very own kitchen. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation. Hey everyone, this is Steve Sabicer with Enlightened Omnivore, and today is our very first podcast, episode 1. And I get to talk about mushrooms. This has been a topic that I've been a bit infatuated with for the last several weeks after a fascinating conversation with my friend and esteemed scientist, Rachel Linzer. Rachel is co-founder and co-director of science at the nonprofit Open Fung and a visiting scholar at Stanford University in mycology. That's mushroom science for us lay people. Today's podcast was recorded a few weeks ago, but Rachel and I got to chat about the resurgent curiosity in fungi and how these organisms work, some of the new and innovative ways science is using them, and how business is trying to turn fascinating organisms into products we can use well into the future. Our chat was so informative that I turned it into a 3-part series on mushrooms that you can follow along on my Substack at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. And remember, you can always subscribe to my newsletter about all things omnivorous at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. Rachel, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me for the conversation. Always excited to talk about fungi.
Yeah, I have so many questions for you today, but why don't we just dig right in? Tell me a little bit about how we're related to mushrooms.
When you think about fungi, they are more closely related to animals than to plants. So the mushroom on your pizza is more closely related to you than to the tomato sauce. And there is just a huge gamut of lifestyles. I mean, it's a huge kingdom. We think we know, a small percentage of what's out there. Folks find more fungi doing more interesting things. And so the knowledge of fungi in ecosystems is exploding. And then consequently, also people are bringing them into the lab and trying to apply them to human problems that need solutions. And that is also exploding.
Fantastic. So can you talk a little bit about fungi or fungi as a kingdom and what is its role in the ecosystem?
In terms of what fungi do in the ecosystem, it's all over the map. So there are fungi that eat dead stuff. Those are really important. If there weren't fungi eating dead stuff, we'd be up to our neck in trees and plants and that never decayed, and those nutrients wouldn't return to feed other things. There are fungi that eat live stuff, so lots of pathogens of plants, animals, humans, other fungi, all the exciting stuff about the insect zombies. That's a thing. Yeah. And there are also fungi that are mycorrhizal. So that's another huge group of fungi in the ecosystem. So that's fungi that live and evolved in really, really, really close association with plants, very, very tight, and actually work together. It's one of the really most famous symbioses of organisms that benefit each other when they interact. So fungi can collect nutrients and things that the plants can't get for themselves through the roots, send that up to the plants photosynthesize, send the fungi food, and it's this really tight association. So that's really cool. So it really, from a human perspective, runs the gamut from helpful to hurtful, all kinds of other things happening.
So can you tell me just a couple of definitions? I hear a lot of these terms, and as I'm reading about fungus, it gets confusing, but mycelium, spores, fruit body, what are these things?
Yeah, so those are different parts of the organism or parts of its life cycle. So when you see a mushroom, the analogy people like to use is it's like an apple on an apple tree. So it's the thing that is the reproductive structure, but there's a whole tree that apple is sitting on. So with an apple tree, it's above ground, we see it. With a fungus, it's generally below ground, and we don't see it very well. It's really hard even for sophisticated scientists to follow. And so fungi in that part of their body, and actually indeed in a mushroom or fruit body, which is the reproductive structure, they don't all look like mushrooms. So fruit body is kind of like a broader term, although people get really offended because it's not really fruits. They're not really plants. There's a lot of confusion. So do we have to call it a sporocarp? Do we have to call it a basidiocarp? We don't know. But
Wow,
fruit
how
body is,
controversial. This is
I know
exciting.
this is like the hot, this is why you can't invite mycologists to parties. Like these are the hot debates. But so fungi grow with these long thread-like cells called hyphae. So it'll be a long thread. It can be quite long, and it can divide up into little subsections of this long thread, those that are individual cells. And the thread can branch, the threads can fuse, but a whole bunch of those threads, which are called hyphae, is called the mycelium. So that's the
Okay, so that's
network of all these threads. Yeah,
right.
and it pops up specialized threads that form a mushroom, and or it sends the threads out into the environment to find food, because fungi can sort of like release enzymes onto their food, so they
Okay.
go through the environment looking for food, and then can digest it that way.
So the mycelium's kind of like the trunk of the tree or the
It's
tree,
kind of like the whole rest of the tree.
the whole
Yeah,
tree. And
yeah.
then these the threads, what did you call them?
They're called hyphae.
And is that
Hyphae.
are those like the roots then or
So those are the
something
hyphae make
else?
up the mycelium. And people do use the analogy, they say, mycelium is the roots of the fungus, but it's actually not really a very close analogy, but it's kind of like the tree plus the roots of the
Right.
fungus. And when you
'Cause
see
it's
a mushroom, that's like the fruit body. That's a reproductive structure.
okay. Cool. All right. And then like
Okay.
reproduction, like we hear about spores and the gills or the cap of the mushroom letting out all the spores. Like is that how most fungi reproduce, or is that like what how does that work?
That's a great question. So we talked about the hyphae and the mycelium, but there are also single-celled fungi, the yeast forms like baker's yeast. Those are all fungi as well, and they can also grow in a single-celled form that just buds off another single cell that buds off another single cell that buds off another single cell. So there are lots of different modes of fungal reproduction. So that's one of them.
Okay.
When you get into this group of the mushroom formers, yeah, they often pop out a fruit body of some kind. They have gills or pores or teeth, and those release spores through sexual reproduction. A lot of fungi can make kind of asexual spores where they just clone themselves and put them in this little resting spore. So if the environment's tough and things get bad, then you can hide in your resting spore and then regerminate. Then there's another group of fungi that kind of roughly get called the molds. So
Okay.
different than the mushroom formers,
Yeah.
that they're called officially ascomycetes. And so some of them have visible fruit bodies like a morel, but a lot of them just send up little bags of spores and spray them out into the world like greenish gray mold on your bread or on
So
your
wait, a
orange.
morel is actually a mold?
It's so mold is a really non-scientific term that I try never to use, but people are like, there's the mushroom fungi and the mold fungi. So that may be something that you've heard, but it's a group called the basidiomycetes form kind of mushrooms, and the ascomycetes form often bread molds, but many other things like baker's yeast is an ascomycete. It's in this other group, and morels are in that other group, even though they have like a cap and a stem. You
Fascinating.
can look at them. They're weird looking. They look kind of alien. They don't look exactly like, you go to the grocery store and buy white button mushrooms. So they are off and another part of the family tree with a similar structure, but it evolved differently and it works a little bit differently.
That's fascinating. Well, and that's actually one of the things that got me. I had two kind of genesis stories of my curiosity with fungus. The first was I went mushroom hunting in France
Mm.
with my wife and a bunch of our friends, and we collected pounds of these delicious wild mushrooms, and they made this mushroom loaf, which was
Mm.
literally just what I think they were called deerwood mushrooms and black trumpet mushrooms, and then like 4 pounds of butter, and they just melted it down into this like dense cake that was just
Mm.
mushroom and butter, and it was magic. And I was like, oh my God, we went and found all this, and I walked around for a half hour and didn't find a single mushroom until somebody showed me how to look for them, and then I was filling shopping bags. um, so that was my first real experience. I mean, I'd eaten mushrooms before, but I hadn't really eaten mostly button mushrooms, things from the grocery store, and hadn't had
Yeah.
wild ones. And then more recently, was walking one evening with a good friend, and we found morels all over, like on the roadside. Like they'd recently just mulched this part of the
Mm.
Foothill
Okay.
Boulevard, and I have a picture. There was a morel the size of my hand, And they just look like these alien. I mean, I knew what they looked like before, but when you see them in nature, you're like, wow, I don't know if I would really have thought to eat this.
Yeah, like the brain on a stick thing doesn't really look
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah.
Fascinating. So you talked a little bit about how they eat fungi. Like, did they operate differently from plants or animals in that way? So, like, do they breathe? Do they eat? Do they
Y-
excrete? Like, how does that work?
yes, they do breathe, they do eat, and they do excrete. So they take in oxygen, release carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So differently than than plants, which
Yeah.
do that, but also take in carbon dioxide, photosynthesize, and make food and release oxygen. The fungi don't make their own food in that way.
Fascinating.
So being fungi, they have also, so you get groups like the lichen,
Hmm.
which have formed one of these really close biological associations. And so lichen are one or more fungal partners that have formed a really tight association with cyanobacterium, blue-green algae, something that can photosynthesize. So they live together. So similar to what we were talking about with mycorrhizae, where the tree photosynthesizes, sends some food to the fungus, fungus sends things up to the tree.
Wait, so lichen are two organisms? They're a
Two
fungus
or more sometimes.
and a plant, and
Yeah,
they
or
and they
yeah,
work
or
together.
like a photosynthesizing algae or photosynthesizing bacterium and one or more fungal partners hanging out.
I had
Yeah,
no
it's
idea.
always an association, always.
So fungi don't produce oxygen; they actually consume it.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
they're like us.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So when
Okay.
we would grow fungi, you put them in a, some sort of growth container, the CO2 levels would just go, through the roof. Or you'd have a whole closet full of bags where you could potentially grow mushrooms. The CO2 levels in the closet as the fungus is growing through its food just rise because they're respiring. They're breathing out
Sure.
CO2, taking in
Sure.
oxygen. Yeah.
And do they need oxygen like plants need carbon dioxide then?
Well, many fungi need oxygen, but there are also what they call anaerobic fungi, so that
Okay.
fungi that don't
Yeah.
that grow without oxygen. But yeah, you've got, as usual, a variety of fascinating, complicated lifestyles. But many fungi do require oxygen. Some can grow without oxygen.
So
Yeah,
what motivated you to get into the world? Would you call it mycology? Are you a mycologist?
I think so. Yeah, I think I'm a mycologist. So I really liked getting out in the field and going into the forest. I'm like, huh. And on my first day of class in graduate school, I was taking a class from my advisor, and on the very first day he's like, okay, so fungi, here are how their genetics work. And the fungi were just absolutely charismatic. They broke all the genetic rules that I thought I knew, and they had all these wacky lifestyles. I'm like, these organisms are fascinating. I love studying them. I want to study them. So I got my PhD in forest pathology and mycology, and then kind of took it from there.
So after 4 years of undergrad, you still didn't have much exposure to fungi. Is that
No.
is that unusual? I mean, I feel like it's a whole nother kingdom. Why not? Why aren't we talking about fungi? So,
Yeah,
what's the story there?
I think that it wasn't unusual at the time. I think it'd be more unusual now. But fungi, even I started grad school in 2002, and over the last 20 plus years, interest has just exploded. Talking to old professors, they're like, my Fungi 101 class used to be sparsely attended, and now it's just bursting at the seams because as fungi have entered the popular culture for a variety of reasons, interest is exploding.
I definitely have noticed this huge explosion in interest in fungi. I'm curious where some of the areas that you've seen that happen. I mean, food, it's always been there, but I think there's this fascination with mushroom hunting. And then obviously like the psychosomatic stuff, the psilocybin and things like that. Are there other areas where you see new research that are getting really interesting? I mean, I'm kind of teeing you up for what you're doing now, but like, what are
Yeah,
those things that are happening outside of food and like recreational or psychological use that are getting popular?
yeah. So there are several areas that are of interest now. So using fungi for food actually kind of falls into, in my mind, three different categories.
Okay.
So you can grow fungi for food the way that it's been done for probably over 1,000 years in human history, where you grow fruit bodies, you take advantage of these fungi that live on dead woods, and then you grow mushrooms, you harvest them, you eat them. That's been happening for, it's been documented for well over 1,000 years, probably more. And then about 100 years ago, people started using fungi as cell factories to make molecules that you could then use in foods.
100
So
years ago?
100 years ago, yeah, Pfizer 100 years ago started using aspergillus fungi, part of this ascomycete mold, to make citric acid. So that's been going on for over a century.
And
And
citric acid just for like food use as a
for
preservative,
food
or
use, yeah, yes,
that's fascinating.
as a preservative.
That's a byproduct of the natural process of the mushroom, or did they do something to the fungi to make it produce citric
A
acid?
100 years ago, it was a natural byproduct, and you grew the hyphal cells, mycelium, in a certain way, and it would create this byproduct. But that category of cell factory, now that there are genetic engineering techniques, people do engineer the fungi to make food molecules that they wouldn't make naturally, like
Wow.
companies engineering fungi to make, say, dairy proteins or egg proteins. And so that's kind of the second category. So fungi as cell factories where you don't even eat the fungus, but they make molecules for you, and you take those molecules and they have different food applications. And then the third food fungus category in my mind is people now growing the mycelium. So not necessarily letting it fruit out as a mushroom, but growing those cells to make alternative proteins. You can grow them and make something that looks like meat.
Rather than eating the fruit, you're eating the tree,
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
trying to get it to taste kind of like meat. I know this isn't your core research, but are they getting that to have nutritional value that's similar to animal protein, or is it just the flavor profile and then you substitute that with other stuff?
It's a good question. I think there's probably a lot of hype, but fungi do create amino acids that aren't as common maybe in plants. So the argument is you can get a favorable amino acid profile and this umami and this texture all in one thing. Like people are making mycelium bacon and mycelium chicken cutlets and stuff like this. So that those are kind of the three categories, and those last two categories are really taking off.
Taking off,
Um,
yeah. No, that I've heard a bit about those. So then what
yeah.
are some of the other areas that are taking off in fungi?
So I used to be at a company that was in this material space. So using fungi either to make a composite material where the mycelium grows through ground up food. It can be agricultural waste. This is forestry waste, but like hemp shards or corn cobs. And then the threads of the mycelium, those hyphal cells, bind it together. And you can use that like for building blocks or maybe insulation, or there's a company that makes acoustic panels. And so there's that whole family of building materials. And then you can also have pure mycelium products. Like you can grow a sheet of pure mycelium, you peel it off with some manipulations and some textiles sometimes, and it makes like a leather or textile substitute, just a sheet of pure mycelium. So you have the pure mycelium materials and these composite materials where it's the mycelium growing in and around its food, making kind of this block.
Wow. Has that started yet? Like, are people making shoes out of mycelium leather?
Uh, so there are definitely lots of prototype shoes
Okay.
made out of mycelium leather, but producing at scale, I think so far it's a pretty new field. With this and the food, though, there's so much excitement and hype, and I think rewinding, you asked why mushrooms, fungi has maybe entered the popular culture at this time. I think a lot of it had to do with Paul Stamets.
Uh-huh.
Complicated figure, but really inspiring to a lot of people.
I
So a lot
follow
of
him on
people,
Instagram.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So a lot of people were inspired. And so now we're in a bit of a reality check period where some of the companies are actually not doing this anymore, and some of them have failed. And it's, oh my gosh, it's a lot harder than we thought. And hey, the problems are complicated. And then also I sort of just started on bioremediation where, fungi, because they eat a lot of different foods, can maybe go in and help with some of the toxic issues that humans have created for
Uh,
themselves.
yeah. So like
So
clean up a Superfund site or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, that's another,
Fascinating.
yeah.
Fascinating.
And then
What is that? So what's that called, or that area of interest? What did
so
you
it
say?
gets called remediation, bioremediation,
Yeah.
or mycoremediation. So there's a lot of interest in that, but that's one of the ones that's really complicated, and a lot of questions come up, like not only is it going to work, but what fungus do you use? Because you don't want to create more of a problem by introducing a fungus that didn't evolve there that then could harm the native plant or microbial communities
Yeah, no,
by just indiscriminately spreading it through the ecosystem.
invasive species. Yeah, we've seen those
Yeah.
challenges with the I just did a video of introducing mosquito fish to my little I have a little water trough for the animals at my cabin up in the desert.
Mm.
And for the last 2 seasons I've had like horrible mosquitoes. And it's just this little, it's maybe 90 gallons of water, but it
Okay.
doesn't take much. So I have a friend at the Lyle Regenerative Center at Cal Poly Pomona, and they have the largest population of mosquito fish in Southern California. So actually, vector control comes and like scoops mosquito fish out to go give to people whose like pools have been abandoned or something and they have too many mosquitoes. So he's like, yeah, you can come by and grab a few. So I grabbed a dozen and took them up to
Yeah.
the cabin and released them last week. So we'll see if they survive, but I'm hoping it'll knock down the the population. But hopefully they don't get into the water table or something and then we have mosquito fish, like in the underground river of the Mojave or something.
Yeah.
So you talked about the barriers. What are some of these barriers? I mean, I know anytime a new technology comes out or a new idea, like what in your work, what are you finding are the barriers to these new uses of fungi?
Yeah. So that kind of brings us to what this current project that I'm working on. Humanity has created a lot of problems for itself. Maybe fungi can contribute to a solution for some of them in a way that is new and people haven't explored fully before. So I mentioned that one of these mold, ascomycete fungi, has been used for over a century to create molecules. But doing something like make a material out of them or try to make a alternative protein food out of them or try to use them in bioremediation or even try to improve regular mushroom growth, or that set of resources is really pretty sparse. These are newer ideas.
So can you patent a fungus?
So you can not patent a living organism that is as you took it from nature, or that's something that you develop, say, through conventional breeding. If you bred a new mushroom in a conventional way, the way that folks have been breeding plants for a long time, that's not something that you can patent. But it is possible if you modify, change, or engineer an organism in certain novel, useful, non-obvious ways.
So like how would you change the mycelium or the fungus in a advantageous way? What are you looking for as a scientist to kind of change or alter something that you'd want to patent?
So some of these applications are really new, but you can imagine thinking about things like how fast something is growing, how strong the cells are, uh, how well branched they are, what kinds of molecules they can produce, how does their surface interact? Can you do something to make it a little bit easier to turn this into a building material? Maybe how strong it is. Can you do something a little bit to make it more like a textile? How flexible it is? Those are all outcomes that people might want to approach through some of this genetic modification or engineering.
So would you use the word GMO? I mean, are you genetically modifying fungi to do these things, like to build materials or to turn into food?
It's not necessary.
Okay.
It's not necessary. So the mushroom industry has existed for a really long time with mushrooms as found in nature. So many cool things have evolved. I mean, you can make a lot with fungi and not modify them at all, but there are some problems that you could maybe overcome most quickly rather than searching the world. Sometimes you just need, it would be helpful just to change one aspect of the organism that maybe would give you a leap forward.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about your organization, Open Fung. What are you folks up to in this crazy world of fungus?
Well, it's a very exciting time to be in fungal biology. Open Fung is something I've been working on for about a year and a half with three other people. It's an artist and scientist led organization that is helping to advance fungal technology. But when you come to fungi, there can be a lot fewer resources, even though they have a lot of promise for things like food, medicine, bioremediation, and biomaterials. So we're hoping that this organization, Open Fung, can help to bridge some of those gaps. So we're trying to do things in three parts. We're doing our own research in-house. We are also trying to create community around this because there are a lot of sort of fragmented places that people are working on these problems, and we want to try to bring people together in an open way to try to pool their resources and efforts, and also to create meaning and engagement with fungi through the arts.
You mentioned art. I mean, I find that really fascinating. How does your organization incorporate the research, the community building, and then using mushrooms as art?
It's a cool organization because sometimes when people put science and art together, it's primarily art focused with a little bit of science tacked on, or primarily science focused with a little bit of art tacked on. But we're trying to build this mission driven organization where the two parts come together co-equally. And half of us were trained as artists. So the reason why these two parts are coming together, the science and the art, particularly around fungi, is it's really a way that people can engage with fungi in a very visceral and sensory way. So a lot of people can still find fungi very off-putting. There's a lot of talk about rot and toadstools and poisoning and decay, and that's what people call mycophobia. So art is a way to really bring people in to engage with these materials in a tangible way. You can hold it, you can feel it, you can touch it, and also a really good way to create meaning and understanding around these organisms in the public space.
Do fungi mutate more rapidly than the other kingdoms, or are they like less stable in that regard, like genetically?
I know within fungi, different areas can have different mutation rates because there's that arms race between the immune or response of the host to the pathogen. To those areas tend to mutate really quickly. And then there are some areas that are just more stable, like housekeeping genes. How do I stay alive and eat my food? That stuff can be more stable,
Well, I'm just thinking
compared
of
to other
like,
organisms.
The Last of Us or something,
Mm.
where like the TV show where the fungus, mutates into something that turns everyone into zombies. I mean, that's a pathogen, right? Like that's kind of the premise.
Yes, and that's based on these insect pathogen fungi that turn insects into zombies.
So it's real.
Yeah, it's not for people, but there are
Not yet.
not yet. Just waiting for that one mutation.
Yeah, no, as you said, another thing to worry about. We've got COVID, we've got, bird
Yeah,
flu, and now we have zombie making fungi. Hey, it's
yeah.
never a dull moment here on planet Earth. But seriously, I mean, I'm sure I think I get the sense of where that one could go, but we're getting a little bit more into fiction than reality.
But based on reality, based on
But
fungal
based
reality,
on
where
reality.
it takes has neurological impacts on insects and turns them into little spore shakers. They go upside down on a branch and just like distribute fungal spores.
Rachel, I'm not going to sleep now tonight. Don't tell me this. I don't want to know that. And
Are
my
you an
kid
ant?
loves ants too, so now I'm
Yeah.
not going to let him go play with them.
I don't know. Yeah, you can look into it more. But
I actually think there was an ant one that
yeah,
does.
there is an ant one.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it like
Yeah.
grows out of the head, and yeah, it's right up there with Hollywood. But
What's
no,
way
I
too
was going
creepy.
to ask you though. And now I've got all I'm thinking about is zombies in my head, so I can't concentrate. But as you're talking about how we apply mushrooms or fungi, to the real world, I think I even saw a video where they peeled this material off of the mycelium, or maybe it's part of the mycelium, and they said, "Oh, this could be a shoe sole." Like, like in those material applications, is that material a byproduct that the fungi created, or is it like part of the tree? You're just like chopping a, you're taking some of the trunk off.
Yeah. So the way that a lot of them work is it's actually mycelium.
Okay.
So you have uh, a sheet of mycelium, these intertwined thread-like cells, and you can peel it off. And sometimes people add byproducts or other things to make it stick together better, or have like a waterproof finish. Sometimes there's different textiles or fabrics that can be incorporated in there for structure and strength, but most of the material is this interconnected mycelium. It grows differently than it would in nature
And
to some
that's
to some extent.
that's because of the kind of proprietary approach. Like they have like the substrate or the container it's in or something like that.
Yeah, it's within what fungi could do in nature, but fungi are crazy. They're a body without a body plan. So it can have this mycelium, it can move around, and there's food over here. We can kill off those cells and have these cells thrive. So there are proprietary interventions in those types of ways, mechanical interventions, food interventions, environmental interventions, but it's not currently that far off of maybe something growing on the inside of a decaying log or something. And other companies can take either like a liquid culture of fungal cells growing in a big liquidy soup and pour it out like a fruit roll up. That's a thing that people do.
Wow.
Also chop up fungal biomass and like compress it, and that's a thing that people do. There's a really old tradition. Paul Stamets has that hat, an Amadou hat. There people would chop up a tinder fungus, kind of compress it like a felt, and you can make a hat out of it.
Wow.
So there's a long tradition of different ways to use this body without a body plan and form it into different materials.
One other question I have is on scaling, because it's one thing to make these materials, turning mycelium into leather or chicken cutlets or even artwork, but can science meet the demand? What are the challenges to scaling?
Yeah. So that is something that a lot of companies have to be really cognizant of from the beginning. So you can imagine that there are really elegant solutions out there that involve fungi. Like you said, making a chicken cutlet or making a material that works at the bench scale, works at the lab scale, requires a lot of input from people, but doesn't really scale up to the industrial scale where we can start talking about having an impact on things that we care about in terms of climate and sustainability. You come up with a solution that scales, but it's so resource intensive that you've blown your sustainability edge. So it is possible to scale fungal production up to an industrial scale. And people do this in a couple of different ways. One way you can do this is grow the fungal cells, the hyphae we were talking about, the filamentous cells, in a really large stainless steel liquid tank or series of tanks. Kind of looks like a steampunk fantasy. And you can get these tanks, they can be even bigger than a story high. They've got a lot of dials and knobs on them, and you can grow a huge liquid culture of a liquid food for the fungus stirred up with all the fungal cells. And you can have tanks that are 1 liter, you can have tanks that are 100 liters, you can have tanks that are 1,000 liters. You could also grow the fungi not in a liquid food, but in a solid food. Say, for wood, a fungus that survives on dead wood, you can grind up sawdust, some other ingredients, and you can have the fungus grow in a solid mass. And you can scale that up at an industrial scale in a more modular way, similar to vertical agriculture, where you have a container that you can grow this fungus eating its food in, and then you can just have a lot of those containers stacked up similarly to what we see in vertical agriculture.
How long does it take mycelium to grow? Are we talking days or weeks?
So it does vary wildly by what fungus you're talking about, what you feed it, and what the environmental conditions are where it's growing. So some of them, yes, you can get a potential fungal product out probably on the scale of days, and some
Wow.
of them that grow more slowly, you might have to talk about the scale of weeks or even months to get the completed growth part of the production happening.
So, do fungus break down animal organisms as well, like rotting, insects and mammals and
Yep,
things like that?
yep.
So that's not bacteria. That's actually fungus doing that.
Usually it's a whole consortium of bacteria, fungi, sometimes other microbes. Yeah, but if
Okay.
there are those videos of like, here's a dead squirrel and here's it's right. So it's often, yeah, fungi can be part of that, but it, also can be led by bacteria. Or
So
fungi
how
can eat living animals whilst they're alive. So fungal pathogens can have structures and chemicals that come out of them to eat alive animals,
yeah,
parts of them. Yeah.
that's again going to help me sleep at night now. But
Sorry.
how old are fungi? Are they as old as the other organism kingdoms?
I
Like
think on the order of,
evolutionary?
yeah, hundreds of millions of years, I think.
I have this story that a paleontology friend once told me how fossil fuels really came about because when dinosaurs roamed the planet, the bacteria hadn't evolved to decompose these huge organisms yet. So when the Tyrannosaurus Rex died, the bodies just piled up. And that's what turned into the coal and the oil deposits that we exploit today. If the same extinction event happened today, would bacteria and fungi just turn all of that material into dirt?
Yeah, so there is a hypothesis out there that when fungi evolved, did play a role in the change of the deposition of coal that happened about 300 million years ago or so. So coal is made of a lot of different materials, and one of the materials is wood. So these lignin cells, that's a component of wood, were piling up like you were describing for the dinosaurs. And then when fungi that could break those molecules down evolved, then you see that coincides about with the time when you see a lot less coal laying down. So David Hibbett was the leader of a study, I think about a decade-ish ago, big study, really, really interesting hypothesis, and led a team to investigate this and found some evidence to support that, yeah, fungi and other decomposing organisms could have played a role in coal
So
deposits.
they started eating the coal.
They actually started eating the trees before they became coal.
Okay, gotcha.
So similar to your dinosaurs, the trees were piling up, and then fungi evolved that could break down some of these really tough molecules in wood, broke them down, and lo and behold, perhaps not as much coal was getting created in the first place because the fungi were breaking down the wood before it could hang out long enough to turn into coal.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is kind of that last example you gave of the repairing the environment. Like fungi could possibly be used to turn byproducts into more favorable materials, or at least into maybe less toxic materials.
Yeah, that's the hope. So fungi can do things like break down some of the bonds in plastics. So there's a lot of interest in plastic being an extremely recalcitrant material, but you want to make sure that you're not breaking down the bonds to a certain extent and just creating a ton of microplastics that are then in the environment. So this is one of the things where there's a lot of hope, like fungi are going to eat all the plastic. But then when folks have really gone in and seen how that process is working biochemically, sometimes they're breaking down some of the bonds and just creating a big pile of microplastics, which is maybe are easier for organisms to take up and
Right.
maybe more polluting than macroplastics.
Okay. Get pictures of mushrooms all over your house? Are you like in
Maybe a few more than I should, but I haven't gone all in. Yeah.
They are beautiful, and I found this book in France of just mushrooms, and I wanted to use some of the images for this post. And I mean, they're magical. They really are kind of otherworldly, and they have this kind of fantastical feeling to them. Do you get any of that as you're doing all this research, like the mystical side of mushrooms?
Yeah, I don't know if I feel mysticism about a lot of things personally. I feel awe of the evolutionary process, and I feel love of the beauty and form, these endless different forms, these beautiful forms that they create. And so I get a bit of that from the research, but I also just like a lot of iNaturalists wandering around taking really short hikes that take way too long and taking a lot of pictures and just looking at them and how beautiful fungi are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. This is super cool.
This was really fun. Sorry, I get really excited, so I hope I didn't talk too much.
Are you kidding? I think it's fantastic that you get excited about topics like this because it is fascinating. I mean, we don't spend enough time understanding the world around us and at this like microscopic level, what's going on. And the fact that, I mean, half of this conversation was completely new to me. I knew nothing about that. So it's fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time.
That's been one of the coolest things in the last quarter century with fungi. Just people discovering more and more and more that was not visible to human perception before. So in ecosystems and beyond. And we didn't even get into space mushrooms, so that's a whole other thing.
We'll have to do that next time.
Yeah, one of our co-founders of OpenFung is working at NASA on space mushrooms.
Space mushrooms!
Mushrooms in space, yeah.
Well, we'll leave it there, but thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
And a special thanks to all of my subscribers for listening to my very first Enlightened Omnivore podcast. You can read more about mushrooms in my 3-part series, or all kinds of other omnivorous topics, on my weekly Substack newsletter, found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com.